Welcome back to Knowledge is Kings, guys. I am Kings, and my thumbnail isn't exactly true. I did use a lathe back in high school to make a wooden salt and pepper shaker. The problem is, I don't remember that far back, and now I'm going to try to turn epoxy as well as wood. I'll start with making the blank. Let's get to it. I was a little worried about how this might turn out, so I didn't want to use any special wood for this project. Instead, I grabbed a couple of scrap pieces of black walnut and maple, and I just squished them in a small mixing cup. The epoxy I'm using is made specifically for me by a chemical company in the good old USA. It is also available on my website, kingswoodshopusa.com. The pigment I'm using is made by Eye Candy, really great company with great customer service and tons of color options to choose from. And no, they are not sponsoring this video. I did 3 separate pours, waiting an hour in between each layer. Then I just slipped the blank out of the mold, or at least I would have if I had remembered to spray foam release in the cup before pouring the epoxy, which I did not remember. Yeah, you'll have that on these big jobs. Once I finally got it out of the cup, I took it over to the bandsaw to cut the excess wood off and then chucked it up in the lathe. It only took a few turns for me to realize that it wasn't in there tight enough. After tightening, it was still slipping, so I had to take it out and try to smash the spur in deeper into the blank. Time out. Here's the problem. Here I have a piece of scrap wood I'll use for my demonstration. Say I need to put this on the lathe. Well, I need to hammer the spur into it, as this is what the lathe uses to spin the piece. So I hammer it in. I do it a couple of times just to get it in really well. It may be hard to see because once the spur is out, the wood presses out again, but it has a deep groove where each spur is. Now I do the same thing to a scrap piece of epoxy. I do it a couple times, but even after that, it just sort of chips it a little, marring the surface. Because the epoxy is so hard, it doesn't want to properly accept the spur. This is one thing that makes it a lot harder to do epoxy on the lathe. Time in. So, using the biggest gouge I have, I just attempted to make it perfectly cylindrical. As it turns out, epoxy will chip out big chunks if you try to take out too much at a time. So to make it work, I essentially need to just let the tip of the gouge barely touch the piece. And I mean like a feather touching the ground suspended by a helium-filled balloon. Another problem I have is the tool rest. I may not remember a lot from way back in high school, but I do remember my finger being able to comfortably rest right behind the groove of the tool rest. That allows me to precisely control the depth of the cut and, by extension, how hard the tool presses against the piece. I remember the whole tool rest, tool, and hand placement felt very natural. This one, made by Grizzly Industrial, feels very awkward and cumbersome. Now, as far as lathes go, it was a relatively cheap one. I think it was about $1,100. I didn't want to spend a ton on a lathe because I wasn't sure if I was going to use it or not. Eventually, I got bored of working on the outside as it was very slow going and I'm not all that patient. So I mounted the workpiece in some jaws to work on the inside. I wasn't sure what the best approach for removing the inside material would be, so I just tried a few different tools to see which would remove the quickest, and as it turns out, none of them would do it. Because the epoxy can fragment, and it really jars the whole project and sends shards flying. See how it catches and jars it loose from the jaws? Yeah, kind of freaky. Okay, so eventually I put a Forstner bit in the lathe and used that to clear out the center portion. Which, when I recorded, I had inadvertently stood in front of the camera, so I don't have any footage of that. But after the center was removed, it actually became a lot easier to remove the rest of it. Once I was tired of working on the inside, I figured it was time to start the sanding. I started with a grinder with an 80 grit sanding wheel attached to get down fast enough through the epoxy grooves. If you've ever sanded epoxy before, you know it takes a while because it is so hard. Then I just went up through the ranks of sandpaper using sandpaper made for my random orbital sander till I got to 400 grit, which is when I started to wet sand. The last sanding I did was with 800 grit. For the finish, I just buffed on a little bit of Odie's oil. I thought this would make the wood and epoxy look nice. And it is food grade, and if this is a cup, I should be able to drink out of it without, getting poisoned. Odie's oil is really easy to work with. Just buff it on and buff it off. Hey, they could have used this Odie's oil in the Karate Kid movie. Like the wax on, wax off, buff on, but never mind. Okay, so you can see the chipping on the bottom of the blue section. This is what happens when the tool would hit the piece too hard. And this happened throughout the whole turning process. It took a while to get this right, to have just a light touch. I took it over to the bandsaw, as you can see, and notice how good the shot is. Then I thought, oh, I should hit the record button. Well, as you can tell, I was already recording, so I lost the footage of the bandsaw, but it looked like this. Actually, it looked closer to this, but I was using the clamp to hold the bottom of the piece. Cutting circular objects on the bandsaw can be very dangerous if you don't take certain precautions. Once that was cut off, I just sanded the bottom smooth on the belt sander and then started to sand it again with my random orbital sander when I realized I'm spending way too much time on the bottom of a piece that will probably get thrown out after this video is done. So I stopped that, added some more Odie's oil, and called it finished. So here is the finished cup, I guess. I doubt I will be using it for drinks, but maybe I will put some rocks in it and use it as a pen holder or something if I don't chuck it out. This project has been sitting around on the lathe for probably more than a month or so. I would work on it every now and then if I was waiting for glue to dry on a different project or something. I wasn't having a whole lot of fun doing it, and I think partly because it was trying to turn the epoxy and not just wood. It's very hard to work with on a lathe, and I think my next project will be made entirely out of wood. I'll have some fun with that, and then go back to trying to do something in epoxy. I wasn't originally going to show this video because I didn't think that it was that enjoyable to watch, but I wanted to show a video of just how challenging a lathe can be. I see tons of videos of professional turners who quickly and easily make awesome projects on the lathe, and wanted to illustrate all the challenges that come with working on the lathe. I'll probably make another video in the future using the lathe, but after I figure out kind of what I'm doing on the lathe. Anyway, don't forget to like this video as it really helps out the channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you can be entered into our current drawing. Details are in the description below. And I'll see you in the next one. Oh, I like that, I guess.